Now on BBC One Scotland, Mark Daly presents a special BBC Scotland investigation into Scotland's Paradise Papers.
This is a story about money and about how the rich and the powerful try and hide it from the taxman.
It's the big guys who are using their power, their strength and their monetary advantage in order to game the system.
There do seem to be different rules for billionaires.
In one of the biggest offshore data leaks in history, we learn how corporate giants shift their profits and avoid the taxman, thanks to the world's tax havens.
The trouble with this stuff isn't that it's illegal. The trouble is that it's legal.
If these companies are not paying their fair share of taxes, then it just means that you and I are paying more. It's as simple as that.
It's a story about how big business and billionaires use an elite law firm operating in tax havens right on Britain's doorstep. It looks like the Isle of Man Executive Company was a tax avoidance vehicle which allowed executives to avoid more than $1 million in tax over 3 years.
That is absolutely wrong.
These are Scotland's Paradise Papers. You've been hearing about a leak. It's a big one. It's from inside Appleby, a law firm with offices in every major tax haven. More than 13 million Appleby documents were obtained by the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung, who shared them with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. The ICIJ has been coordinating a global investigation which includes BBC Panorama, The Guardian newspaper, and involves more than 350 journalists in 100 countries.
These are documents that should never have seen the light of day, basically. Every person who pays taxes should care about what we're seeing here. We're looking at a firm called Appleby, and they're part of what they call the magic circle of offshore law firms. In other words, the elite of the elite.
And there are some big names. Lewis Hamilton's tax dodge on his private jet. Cast members of Mrs. Brown's Boys offshore tax avoidance scheme. And the inner circles of the most powerful men in the world.
You can't dismiss this as just a few bad guys. This is a whole system used by the most powerful and the wealthiest, the biggest corporations, exposed.
BBC Scotland's investigations team is the only Scottish media partner with access to the leak and has been working inside the Paradise Papers for the past 6 months. There are thousands of documents relating to Scots businesses and people. Some of them you'll have heard of and some you won't. But they've all got one thing in common: avoiding tax. Blackstone, not a household name, but a global private equity giant, managing over $350 billion worth of assets. Its founder and chief executive is Stephen Schwarzman, a close confidant of President Trump, and his company has a major interest in Scotland. St Enoch Centre in Glasgow, one of the most recognisable buildings in the country. It was bought by Blackstone in 2013 for £190 million. Blackstone is one of Appleby's biggest customers, and the law firm was integrally involved in the purchase of St Enoch. The Paradise Papers laid bare the lengths that Blackstone, one of the biggest, richest companies in the world, went to avoid paying UK taxes. The data reveals the confidential reports by one of the UK's biggest accountancy firms, Deloitte. Under the codename Project Genesis, they provide a step-by-step guide tailor-made to help Blackstone avoid tax at every stage of the purchase of St Enoch. It starts with a deft swerve of £7.6 million in stamp duty land tax, made possible by owning the shopping centre through a Jersey Property Trust, or JPUT. Jersey is a Crown dependency, which means it's independent, but ultimately the UK is responsible. And like several of the UK's overseas territories, it's a tax haven. Jersey specialises in trusts, and there are thousands of them based here. One of the many benefits to holding, say, property in a trust is privacy. It's completely hidden from the public. But one of the other main attractions is that they can help companies avoid paying British taxes. The trust we're interested in is operated by something called the St Enoch Centre Trustee Company Limited. Its registered address is here at Appleby's Jersey office. Its directors are Appleby staff. It's a brass plate company, which means a company with no obvious economic relationship to a shopping centre in Glasgow. So what did the island's leading politician think about companies using Jersey to avoid the UK taxman?
If there are concerns in the United Kingdom about how people are structuring their investments in the United Kingdom, then the United Kingdom government should change its tax code to deal with them.
Some organisations use companies within Jersey in a complicated ownership structure. Some might say that the way that the Jersey trusts operate isn't transparent. Couldn't you go further?
United Kingdom government and their competent authorities can request information about what's happening in Jersey wherever they might have a concern, and we're at the stage now where that information can be exchanged in as little as an hour.
We asked George Turner, a tax researcher and campaigner, to look at the structure for us.
What you have here at the St Enoch Centre, to all intents and purposes, an economic fiction. The property is owned by a trust in Jersey, so when the original owner sold the property to Blackstone, then they weren't selling the property itself, they were selling an interest in the trust that owned the property. And because that trust is owned offshore, they can avoid stamp duty.
So that's £7 or £8 million right from the off, saved.
Saved or taken.
The Jersey Trust is owned by a series of Blackstone Luxembourg companies. Despite having a major base in London, Blackstone has been given non-resident landlord status by HMRC, meaning they can collect rental income on the property tax-free and send it to Luxembourg. The data suggests that could be up to £10 million a year, but they should pay corporation income tax on that in Luxembourg. But do they?
The rental income which is coming in, the companies that are receiving that are then borrowing huge amounts of money from other companies which are part of the Blackstone group. Now, when they borrow that money, they need to pay interest on it, and those interest payments destroy any profitability in those companies.
And the end result is no tax is due?
Yeah, and because they're borrowing money from themselves, they can claim a tax deduction on that.
According to public documents, the Luxembourg companies in the St Enoch structure paid just a few £1,000s a year in taxes. And guess what? If Blackstone sells the place on, the Jersey Trust structure will allow them to avoid capital gains tax too, which could run into tens of millions. It seems like a complete charade. A Glasgow shopping centre generating cash and rental income here in Scotland. But that cash flows tax-free out of Scotland and into Luxembourg via the offshore tax haven where the St Enoch Centre is effectively owned, Jersey. Deloitte, the architects of the structure, declined to comment. It's not the first time Blackstone used these methods. This is Chiswick Park, a business centre in West London. Blackstone bought it in 2011, and in tax advice, this time from accountancy firm PwC, there was no messing about. It states the tax structure was designed to mitigate, where possible, taxes on acquisition, to minimise ongoing income, corporate withholding and other taxes in UK, Jersey and Luxembourg, to minimise tax on exit from a UK, Jersey and Luxembourg perspective.
The language really is quite shocking in places because it's so clear and blatant what the intention is.
Blackstone sold most of Chiswick Park to the Chinese government in 2014 for a profit of up to £300 million. So it would appear that Blackstone followed the PwC advice to the letter and so paid zero in stamp duty, next to nothing on the millions of pounds of rental income this place generated, and zero on capital gains. Not a bad bit of business. PwC told the BBC, "The advice we provide is given in accordance with all applicable laws, rules and regulations, including proper disclosure to tax authorities." In a statement, Blackstone said, "Blackstone's investments are wholly compliant with UK and international tax laws and regulations. The properties in question were acquired from institutional investors and are of a type commonly used for investments in UK real estate, and were adopted after appropriate advice was taken from leading tax and legal advisors." So whilst Blackstone was the beneficiary of the structure, it was Appleby who implemented it. And that's what they do. They'll create companies for you in tax havens, even provide the directors. There are thousands of examples of this in the data, and some specifically involve one of Scotland's biggest industries. Ithaca Energy, a Canadian company but with headquarters in Aberdeen. In 2012 they were in the process of buying a share in this. FPF1 is a floating oil production vessel. The company agreed a deal for £18 million to buy half of FPF1 and share it with 2 other companies. But just days before the transaction, they decide they need a shell company in a tax haven. So why would a Canadian firm with its headquarters here in Aberdeen need a Bermudan company to hold its stake in an oil platform operating in the North Sea? The Paradise Papers could have the answer. Ithaca's Aberdeen office tells Appleby, "It is important for our tax position that the company is managed and controlled from Bermuda." Seems clear enough. Ithaca need the company to operate properly for tax reasons. Appleby agree to provide a local director. There are reasons to head to Bermuda other than for its sun-kissed beaches. Perhaps the island's generous tax laws. There are no taxes on profits or income. But does the company have any real business in Bermuda, or is it just a show for tax purposes? Take this minute of a company board meeting in June 2012. It says 2 Ithaca executives called in from Canada and the UK, and Appleby's Bermudan director fails to attend. An Ithaca board meeting in Bermuda, with apparently no one in Bermuda. We asked an international tax expert for his opinion.
I think the reality of the matter is that this whole show was being run from Aberdeen, not from Bermuda. And the only reason to have a Bermuda company in there is because Bermuda is a tax haven and they can get interest into it without paying taxes, and whenever the Canadian company wants to withdraw the money, they can withdraw the money without paying any taxes. I can't see any other reason to have this extra holding company in the structure.
FPF1 only started producing oil this year, and because of tax breaks won't pay UK tax until 2020 anyway, so what's the point?
I think the point is looking forward. You want to plan ahead when you do these things, because doing it when you actually are profitable is harder.
For a few weeks we've been trying to get some answers from Ithaca about just what exactly the purpose of this Bermudan company was. Now they say it's got nothing to do with tax. Our evidence suggests otherwise. I'm going to go knock on their door and see if someone will talk to us. Hello.
Hello.
Mark Daly, BBC Scotland.
Mark Daly, how are you?
Very well, thanks, Mr Thomas.
That's me, yes.
We're just trying to find out what the purpose of the Bermudan company is.
Well, the Bermudan company exists in order to hold an asset that we have a share of.
Mm-hmm. Why hold it in Bermuda?
It's convenient for future deals that we may do. It's a complex business.
Is it a real company, the Bermudan company?
Absolutely.
Because nothing really happens there, does it? I mean, you have board meetings. I mean, you've even had board meetings where there's been nobody physically present, and people have been calling in from abroad. That would suggest, would it not, that the company's been managed and controlled from outside of Bermuda?
Mark, you're concocting a story, and I don't think it's helpful to to create a story based on partial information.
Maybe you could give us the full picture then. The information that we have suggests very strongly that the Bermudan company was created for tax purposes.
No, that's not true. I think we've said that very clearly that that's not true. Now, you can choose to believe us or not believe us. That's up to you. Have a good day.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much for speaking to us. In a statement, Appleby says it works in highly regulated jurisdictions and advises clients on legitimate and lawful ways to conduct their business. Within the millions of documents in this leak, we can see it's not just corporate giants who have used Appleby to help them to try and avoid tax. Our data reveals even middle-sized property developers were getting in on the act. This is Logie Green Road in Edinburgh. In 2009, a number of addresses on this street were sold by a group of investors who included two well-known Edinburgh property developers called Alex Watts and Chris Stewart. The deal was done for a very healthy profit indeed. The data shows more than $5 million in profit was made, $750,000 due to Stewart and 1.3 to Watts. The data suggests they tried to take their cut offshore to the Isle of Man, where Appleby, who were then called Dickinson Cruikshank, created a land trust called the Palmerston Partnership. An internal Appleby memo sets out the purpose of the scheme: a UK property development in Scotland utilising a land trust partnership structure to mitigate any tax due. Profits from the sale have been distributed amongst the partnership. And here's how it worked for the Edinburgh pair. An Isle of Man vehicle was created called the Palmerston Partnership. Two offshore trusts were also created, one for Stewart and one for Watts. The profits from the Logie Green Road land deal flowed into the partnership in the Isle of Man. From there, Stewart and Watts' cuts were moved into their trusts, of which they and their families were beneficiaries. And it gets more complicated. Appleby set up two more companies to act as trustees, called Buttermore and Cuttermore. These were supposedly independent of Stewart and Watts. Appleby staff then sign off on a series of loans to companies registered in Scotland, which were controlled by Stewart and Watts. So what does all that mean? I needed an expert, and Philip Simpson is one of the country's leading tax QCs.
The structure is well known as a tax avoidance structure. And certainly the documents that I've seen strongly suggest that the motive for using it was to avoid UK tax. So it's difficult to come to any conclusion other than that the purpose of it was avoiding UK tax in what was a fairly aggressive manner.
But in 2012, the taxman came calling. A deeply unhappy Mr. Watts wrote to Appleby expressing concern over the way the structure had been managed, which could weaken any position with HMRC, which he said would be looking to attack wherever they can. Seemingly worried HMRC will see through the scheme, Mr. Watts writes, "If as a layman I am picking these up, what am I missing that experts at HMRC will not?" In layman's terms, the taxman caught up with them. That's what it looks like.
I suppose if one put it in a colloquial manner, one might put it like that.
Appleby documents suggest the pair had, at least initially, avoided more than £1 million in tax from the profits. So I had a few questions for Mr. Watts. Mr. Watts, hi there, Mark Daly, BBC Scotland. Just got a few questions for you, would you mind?
I would mind, actually.
Would you?
Yeah.
I'd just like to ask you about your offshore trust.
Okay.
We have written to you to ask a few questions about your trust.
And we've written back, so I think we've been fairly reasonable with you, and we've written back to you. But I think what you're doing is really pretty unethical, actually, from journalistic guidelines. So I'd rather just leave it there.
Well, the thing is, you haven't actually answered our questions, which is why we're here this morning. On the profits of the Palmerston Partnership, £1.3 million was your share. How much tax on that did you pay?
I'm not going to answer. You've written to us and we've responded to you.
Why did you open a trust in the Isle of Man? Was it to avoid tax?
The answer is no comment. We've given you a statement, and what you're doing here is unreasonable and unfair.
Mr. Watt's spokesperson told us he was a positive tax contributor who had always lodged his tax returns. He added that following legislative changes, Mr. Watts entered into open and cooperative discussion with HMRC to establish any potential tax due on a retrospective basis. Mr. Stewart's spokesperson told us that all tax has been paid in full and any retrospective tax payments paid ahead of timescales discussed with HMRC. She added that there was no case to answer, that HMRC was in possession of all the relevant facts and that no tax is owed to HMRC. The key to the Palmerston Partnership was the Isle of Man. Stories about the island come up again and again in the Paradise Papers. I'm here to investigate one of them. It involves a billionaire and private jets.
The aviation business is clearly a big part of what Appleby does in the Isle of Man. The trouble with this stuff isn't that it's illegal. The trouble is that it's legal. But it's only available to people with enough money to pay the right lawyers and accountants to do it for them.
One day in June 2012, there was much excitement in the office behind me. Appleby had just been contacted by a very exclusive Swiss aviation company called ExecuJet. Could you set up an Isle of Man company for us, Appleby were asked. Yes, we could, they said. Could you provide some directors for us? Yes, we could, Appleby said. And can you do it today? We'll try our very best, Appleby said. The firm even waives some of its usual background checks to guarantee it closes the deal. Perhaps because the owner of ExecuJet is one of the richest men in the world, Dermot Desmond, best known as the largest single shareholder of Scotland's biggest football team, and with an estimated fortune of around £2 billion. He's familiar with offshore. His 35% stake in Celtic is held in Gibraltar. He's also no stranger to controversy. Matt Cooper, sued by Mr. Desmond in 2011, has written extensively about him.
Dermot Desmond came to prominence during the 1980s in Ireland, and he was regarded as sort of somewhat brash, somewhat flash figure. You don't become a billionaire unless you are absolutely aggressive in making sure that you make as much profit as you can from your businesses and that you keep as much of that profit for yourself.
Mr. Desmond's luxury jet firm had offices all over the world. So why did they need Appleby to make them an Isle of Man company? This internal Appleby memo states ExecuJet had taken Swiss tax guidance and found out that having their Swiss headquarters as the main company on their insurance policy has a negative tax consequence, as they would need to pay a 5% levy under Swiss law. ExecuJet would like to set up a company in the Isle of Man, namely ExecuJet Isle of Man Limited, to be the primary insured under the policy. So by switching to a brass plate company set up by Appleby, ExecuJet swerves up to $190,000 a year in Swiss taxes, just like that. But that's not all. ExecuJet also receives a brokerage fee back from its insurers every year, but this is classed as income and should be taxed in Switzerland. Appleby can see to that too. In another memo, Appleby writes, "This is a low-risk structure that has been set up to receive monies due to ExecuJet under the insurance policies on the group aircraft. By having the monies paid into the Isle of Man entity, ExecuJet are not required to pay Swiss tax on the income of around 22%. We expect to receive 2 payments per year of approximately $600,000. For ExecuJet to get the tax benefits of being based in the Isle of Man, it has to be managed and controlled from there. But the only employees there are the directors Appleby provided for them. And it seems Switzerland was calling the shots. This email from head office clearly instructs Appleby to transfer more than $500,000 to the group's bank account in Switzerland.
My understanding, having read the legislation, is that if individuals in Switzerland are making all the decisions, from a Swiss point of view, the Isle of Man company may be resident in Switzerland for tax purposes. And if it's resident in Switzerland, then despite the structure that has been put in place, stamp duty is due on the insurance premium paid, and Swiss corporation tax is due on the money received back from the insurance broker.
So the Swiss taxman might have something to say about up to $1.3 million in tax that seems to have been avoided by Mr. Desmond's company.
Would you say that this was aggressive tax avoidance in operation?
I think it would certainly be reasonable to describe this as aggressive, given in particular what appears to be a lack of any economic substance to the Isle of Man company.
I'd hoped someone at ExecuJet Isle of Man's office, which is here at Appleby, could provide some answers. We've got some questions about some companies that are registered here. ExecuJet, the Palmerston Partnership.
If you write your details down, I can pass information on.
No joy. So perhaps Mr. Desmond himself could provide some answers. We knew there would be one place his own private jet would be flying into on a Champions League evening, and so we tried to catch up with him there.
Were you aware that whilst the company was under your control, that ExecuJet was using a shell company in the Isle of Man as a tax avoidance vehicle?
We never use any company as a tax avoidance vehicle.
What was the Isle of Man ExecuJet company for then, if not for avoiding tax?
Well, then you'll have to educate yourself.
So, so ExecuJet asked Appleby to set up effectively a shell company in the Isle of Man so that the company would not be liable for Swiss aviation tax. Is that not the case, Mr. Desmond?
You're incorrect.
Could you put me right then?
I'm not duty bound to educate you in how we run our affairs.
So we have written several letters to you to try and get clarity on what the situation is, and what it looks like the Isle of Man ExecuJet company was a tax avoidance vehicle which allowed ExecuJet to avoid more than $1 million in tax over 3 years.
That is absolutely wrong.
But maybe you could tell us, what was the Isle of Man company for if not to avoid tax, Mr. Desmond?
That is our own business. So every company in the Isle of Man is not for avoidance of tax.
One final question. Did ExecuJet Isle of Man help ExecuJet EAG avoid tax?
Absolutely not.
Okay, Mr. Desmond, thanks very much for your time. Mr. Desmond wasn't prepared to give too much detail about the Isle of Man company, but what he did say was that it was not a tax avoidance vehicle. But I'm afraid, in terms of what the Isle of Man company was actually for, I'm none the wiser.
The next day, Mr. Desmond wrote me a letter. Dear Mr. Daly, are you a Rangers supporter? He added that during my period of majority ownership, ExecuJet was tax and regulatory compliant in all the various jurisdictions it operated in, nor was it under any investigation. There are good operational reasons for having a presence in the Isle of Man, and many international companies do so. Appleby told the BBC it had thoroughly and vigorously investigated the allegations, and they were satisfied that there is no evidence of any wrongdoing, either on the part of ourselves or our clients. The Paradise Papers have given us an insight into the secret world of the rich and powerful, and we've learned many of them do not appreciate the scrutiny. Tax loopholes will close and regulations will tighten, but firms like Appleby are paid millions to find the gaps. The impact of this story is being felt across the globe, but the offshore world continues to turn, and much of what goes on remains shrouded in secrecy, until, that is, the next big leak.